Did you want to say something? Fish populations are dwindling. Farms are becoming less productive. Infectious diseases have multiplied. And weather disasters are escalating to unheard of extremes. But it's not too late. This could all be reversed if everyone got together and just started taking the bus. Maybe. Now, what I just said is known as hyperbole. Kinda, not really. A 2023 UN report said that the Earth is gonna reach dangerous temperatures in 10 years, which will push the planet past the point of catastrophic warming. Well, not great. Is there anything we can do, you and me? Is there anything we can do to stop this horrific ending to our story? Answer, no. Genuinely, there's diddly shit you and I can do to stop this. Despite what we were taught in the early 2000s, you can't really recycle your way out of this apocalypse. At the end of the day, this really falls on corporations. So go ahead and clock it. I'm immediately talking shit about late-stage capitalism. We're speedrunning a big Tugg video. Since 1988, 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions. And 25 corporations and state-owned entities are responsible for over half of global emissions. And most of these, and this is gonna be a shocker, I don't want to surprise anyone, are oil companies. You know, those guys who make gas, so your car can Mazda zoom zoom. And yeah, Shell is putting out commercials that say they made a new type of gas that polar bears fuck with, but at the end of the day, they're very aware they're killing this planet. But even though global warming is not your fault, fully, it doesn't help that you'd rather drive your own car to work and do it with the windows down and the AC blasting. But that wasn't always the case. Flashback. See, it's the 1920s. People are enjoying the drug-filled original formula of Coca-Cola, and the stock market's never gonna crash. Also, the majority of Americans living in the Big Apple and other rinky-dink cities are using streetcars to get to work. That's enough of that accent. You know, streetcars, the amalgamation of all the worst parts of a car and a train and a road. Streetcars are still around, but if you're jumping on a streetcar, you're definitely not using it to get to work. You're most likely a tourist who is subconsciously participating in some kind of pre-polio vaccine cosplay. But nowadays, streetcars are outdated, but most people don't even take the subway. In 2023, only 3.1% of Americans took public transportation to work. Now, there are multiple reasons why Americans don't like pub trans, and I'm gonna shorten that in this video. It sounds corny, but just let me do it. I don't have time to say those two words over and over again, and I'm wasting time just explaining this. It could be because they don't like the crazy guy talking to himself, or they just don't enjoy the smell of fresh urine. But in all honesty, the reasons that we don't take the train go way deeper than just not wanting to hang out with less than desirable humans. In a not so roundabout way, the destruction of our public transportation infrastructure can be traced back to a friend of the channel, Henry Ford. Ford, of course, was famous for being a raging anti-Semite. Did I say friend of the channel? I misspoke. He also revolutionized the automobile industry by creating the Model T. Ford was quoted as saying, "I will build a motor car for the great multitude. It will be so low in price that no man making a good salary will be unable to own one." And that game plan, well, it worked. 15 million Americans bought the Model T. But this really complicated life for the common streetcar. Remember those? I talked about them earlier. Before the Model T came around, streetcars owned the road. And that makes sense because they were fucking big and they really took up most of the street. But once 10% of the population started driving, the streets became so crowded that the streetcars couldn't operate on schedule. Then driving became a more reliable option, prompting more people to buy cars. And back then, streetcar companies were privately owned. It wasn't like the modern, subway system that New York owns. Many streetcar companies had signed contracts with local governments that forced them to maintain the pavement around their tracks. So streetcars were getting screwed because they were forced to subsidize the upkeep of roads used by the same product that was putting them out of business. Of course, these companies that owned the streetcars were going bankrupt. And by the 1950s, they were getting bought up by companies like National City Lines. National City Lines was a holding company that was owned by companies such as General Motors, Firestone Tires, and Standard Oil. And they just ripped up all the streetcar lines, and they were like, that's enough of that, let's focus on the cars now. Also, quick side note, it is fucking crazy that they made all those cars and they had zero game plan for like laws and regulations for those things. 10 million people owned the Model T and there was no stop signs. There was no intersections. There was no traffic control. People were just driving on the sidewalk. There weren't sidewalks because who needed those back before the car? Not to say that car laws and public safety have been controlled. We'll get to that later. Speaking of later, I'm going to once again talk about, and I'm not doing this on purpose, the Cold War. I don't even know if this is a self-fulfilling prophecy or like if I'm looking for it at this point, but does everything go back to the Soviets? Once Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected president, he viewed the highways as vital to the safety of America, since they would also make it easier for Americans to evacuate cities once the Soviets dropped the bombs. I don't know about you, but sitting in 5-lane standstill traffic is how I want to die. In 1956, the federal Federal Highway Act was passed, and the government agreed to spend $24.8 billion over the next 13 years on highways. In the early 20th century, there was 17,000 miles of streetcar lines running through major US cities, and today the interstate stretches across roughly 47,000 miles of this great United States. And if all of this, replacing streetcars for highways sounds familiar, that's because it was the plot of Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Did you guys pay attention to that part of the movie? Because I certainly didn't. Anyway, let's move on to the rise of car culture. Today, 91.7% of American households own a car. There are over 283 million cars legally registered in America, and to put that in perspective, for every 1,000 Americans, there are 797 cars. That's a lot of cars. Too many cars, I might add. The only thing Americans have more of is guns. And statistically, cars are more dangerous than guns most of the time. And don't come in the comments saying, well, guns aren't dangerous. People are, I'm not starting that conversation. We're bitching about cars today. In terms of cars being dangerous, I haven't owned a car for 10 years. I've lived in major cities, I've taken public transport, so this is gonna sound preachy, and that's because it is. According to the CDC, there are 13.4 fatalities on the road per 100,000 people, compared to the 14.5 fatalities per 100,000 people that happen due to guns. So guns are more dangerous, but like cars are really close. The likelihood of you dying in a car is like the #1 way you're gonna die if you're under the age of 45. So if you're afraid of flying, that's a silly phobia, and you should put all that fear into the fear of dying in a car, because that's not silly, that's actually a real thing that's probably gonna happen to you. Cars aren't just killing people though, they are, as previously mentioned, killing the environment as well. 2023 was the hottest summer on record in the last 2,000 years. And that kind of statement makes me wonder what was going on in the year 23, but once again, I'm not getting into that. 100 years ago, the Model T could get upwards of 20 miles to the gallon. And today, that is the same gas mileage that most trucks get. So like, what the fuck are we doing? Why aren't we getting better at this? I mean, the good news is electric vehicles are starting to sell better, to the dismay of people who suck. In 2020 alone, there was a 39% increase in electric vehicle sales. It's not solving any problems, actually. It's not helping really at all. 2020's SUV sales canceled out all benefits of oil reduction from electric vehicle sales. And also the fact where we're getting our electricity in America, it's not good. It's like coal and shit, so it's not that's also a problem. Overall, in America, 39% of carbon dioxide emissions come from our cars. So we could all, get together if we all ditched gasoline and take out that impending doom, right? If we all just stopped using gas. Probably be better, I would surmise to say. Well, unfortunately, there are a few billion-dollar industries that would like to pick a bone with that concept. And by pick a bone, I mean kill you. They might just kill you. The automotive industry spent about $85.8 million on federal lobbying in 2023. And in that same year, the oil and gas lobby spent about $133 million. So, but keep posting your infographics on Instagram. That's gonna really turn the tides. We are so fucked. But that's not to say that Americans are fully against the idea of, sharing a ride to get to the loop. The U.S. spends tons of money on public transit. In 2022, the government allocated $57 billion to the smelly boxes we all ride, and yet somehow it's still miserable and ineffective. It's still dog shit for some reason. Take the only major city I lived close to when I was 12, Boston, Massachusetts. They spent $2.2 billion to renovate their trains. We call it the T, us locals. And it was, for lack of a better term, a fucking shit show, kid. It was like they weren't even fucking trying. It did so poorly that there are miles worth of track where the train has to move at 3 miles per hour or it will derail. I googled it, even Power Wheels get up to 5 miles per hour. You're better off taking the Barbie Jeep to get to work. Or how about Seattle, where I first met my girlfriend? They just got a fancy new light rail system that took 20 years to connect the city and billions of dollars to finance, and now the escalators are always broken. Now I know what you're thinking, Tucker, that doesn't seem like a big deal, but it is shockingly crippling the city. During 2017 and 2018, light rail station escalators broke down 2,115 times for a total of 19,289 hours. The equivalent of 803 days. A year has 365. I'm no mathematician, but that's over a year. What the fuck's going on up there? Why just fix the escalators, goddammit? And even when these logistical failures are worked out, public transportation suffers from things like delays and a lack of service, and once again, it often smells like pee. It's not like Americans don't want to ride the subway either. A lot of us really fuck with the idea. A recent survey revealed that 75% of Americans would use public transportation systems if they didn't suck so much. But then we have the issue of how goddamn big this country is. This country is huge. Because of the suburban sprawl that replaced the tight grids of the early 20th century, having pub trains to connect a city with suburbs is incredibly inefficient. And then making matters worse that for some reason, certain Americans think that public transportation is a form of welfare, so it gets weirdly political. It's very upsetting. And this mentality makes funding and fare increase a wildly politicized issue. So let's just go top to bottom here, okay? We've created roads that make efficient public transportation nearly impossible. Fucked up the infrastructure that we're trying to
to build, won't allow fare increases to pay for the services themselves, which exacerbates the already terrible service, creating even less incentives for anyone to ride them. So, top to bottom, pretty shitty public service we have. It just sounds like a poop sandwich made with poop bread. It's poop all the way through. But it can't just be America dealing with this issue, right? There has to be other modernized cities and countries that have the same bullshit we're dealing with. In Japan, 57% of adults take public transit to work. Their bullet train zips across the country at 200 miles per hour with bento boxes and free Wi-Fi. And since their introduction in 1964, there have been no deaths caused by bullet train collisions or derailment. Okay, they're safe and always on time. Fuck me. All right, okay, they got it figured out. Imagine a train that could take you from Chicago to New York City in the same time it takes to watch the Justice League Snyder Cut. I mean, that sounds almost impossible. I literally have to take a fucking plane to get from Worcester to New York to visit family because the train takes 4 hours and it's extremely inefficient and way more expensive. I mean, we're currently building a high-speed train in America, but that only goes between Las Vegas and LA. Who needs that? Who asked for that? The only high-speed railway we have is for degenerates to be degenerates faster. It's ridiculous. How about Luxembourg? Let's look at Luxembourg, a country I often forget exists. All public transportation is free there, so we're starting off pretty hot. But surprisingly, 75% of residents there own a car, so they're stupid, like Americans. Haha. But 43.7% of residents still use public transportation daily. Well, why is that a thing? Is that possible where you can own a car and still use public transportation? Like you can go to work using public transportation on weekdays and then have a car for fun things on the weekends? No, that's an impossible reality. That's an impossible goal to achieve, and I am embarrassed for even having to suggest it. All right, how about Colombia? Surely they're fucked up like us. So to provide access to the city for citizens who live in steep hilly settlements, a series of 6 gondola lines were built. Gondolas? You mean the thing at Disney? I mean, I guess if it works. It does seem to work. It seems to work very well, actually. And honestly, that does sound like fun. Oh my god, imagine taking a ski lift to go to work. God, every other country can figure this out. Why can't we? Okay, so even though statistically more people prefer their sad march to the office in their own automobile, there are still millions of rising grinders who use public transportation to get to work every day. And I'm going to talk about some of those systems and methods and explain their good things and bad things so you don't have to push that 2005 Honda Civic to Kinko's every day, okay? Up first, we have carpooling. Now, carpooling isn't great. It's having your car and eating it too. That was not a good way to say that. But you know, at least it's something. You're attempting to save gas and therefore the planet and also money. Although it doesn't save that much carbon emissions. Really, not really notable amount. Carpool lanes, or HOV lanes if you're nasty, are sick as hell and dope as fuck. They were relatively uncommon until 1973, when the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries placed an oil embargo on the US. Because of that little move, the price of oil jumped up 43% in just 1 year. Holy fuck. Gasoline shortages caused long lines at the pump, and people were even stealing gas by siphoning it from other cars. And for the first time, Americans were introduced to the concept of reducing fuel consumption. The idea of multiple people vehicle lanes gained traction, providing incentive to carpoolers by allowing them to bypass congestion. By incentivizing carpooling, congestion itself would theoretically decrease. And it's true that less cars mean less emissions, but it's really, like I said before, it's not doing that much for carbon emissions. And in 2022, 8.6% of people are carpooling, which is not a lot at all. And coincidentally, a recent survey revealed that 8% of US adults say they have no close friends. Jeez, oh my god. That's fucking sad. Well, still, I think carpooling is a good start to get these, environment-destroying death machines off the road. But you also gotta wait for like a semi-work friend to get out of work in order for you to get home, and that waiting period is one of the worst things a human being can go through. So I understand your apprehension from jumping on the carpooling idea. Next up is trains. Where my rail people at? Where my rail fuckers at? So even though America is years away from the idea and concept of a bullet train, we do have Amtrak. Fuck. We have Amtrak. Not only is it the biggest passenger train company in the US, it's the only one. It's the only one we can use. And they use that to leverage lazy service and terrible website UI. Amtrak got its start in 1971 when many train companies were on the verge of bankruptcy. Car and plane travel had really cut into the, inner city traffic thing that the trains were doing at the time. But train companies were forced to continue running costly passenger service due to their common carrier obligation with the government. Basically, even though the majority of the profits that the train companies were getting were from moving freight, they were still duty bound to have passenger trains, and those made the money really, they were getting the money sucked out of them. The government realized that losing train companies would be hurting the economy, so they created Amtrak to absorb commuting and traveling needs. What's that? The American government taking over an entire industry just for the betterment of people? I smell communism knocking on the door. Well, technically Amtrak is like a quasi-public corporation. It's owned and managed as a for-profit corporation, even though most of it is owned by the US government. And in all honesty, Amtrak does its job. It doesn't do a great job, doesn't do a good job either, but it does what it needs to do. And congested congested areas like the Northeast, taking the train on longer commutes might actually save you time. I take the train a lot when I go back home or when I have to visit my girlfriend in Philly because God forbid I have a loved one within walking distance of me. And considering how awful plane travel is nowadays, where you gotta get in a car or a ride share, you gotta find parking, the TSA, it's a fucking nightmare. Taking an intercity train for a trip like New York to DC could be equally efficient and definitely less harmful to the environment. Although it is fucking scary how little security there is to get on a train. Like, there's not even a metal detector. I just get right on it and I'm looking around like there might be a fucking real troublemaker on this thing. Amtrak also is not the most efficient form of travel or always the cheapest. Like I said, I'll take a plane to go to Massachusetts because it's like $400 to get there on the Amtrak back and forth, which is insane. But it is scenic. It's kind of cute. It's kind of fun to, you know, ride through the Northeast and see all the beautiful leaves change out the window. It's cute. Also, if you take the train going from New York to Boston, there's a stop called New London, and it makes me laugh every time I'm there. It's just like a shitty little town. They named it New London, and it's a stop. And it's very funny to me because it obviously used to be an industry town, and it kind of fizzled out. But like the Pilgrims got there, and they landed, and they looked around, and they said, "All right, this is gonna be the next London. This is gonna be big. It is." And then we got buses, which is not buses are bad. They're like the worst form of transportation. I have no statistics or proof for that, but buses fucking suck. Taking a bus might be my least favorite thing to do ever, always. You want to watch a man spit tobacco in a half-full Taco Bell cup while it sloshes around every time the bus stops? Well, you'll love the bus, brother. Sure, the train is gross. I mean, it does smell like the inside of a fucking toilet, but the bus is equally, if not worse. And it smells like piss-covered denim. The bus has a huge disadvantage over other forms of public transit because it's at the mercy of traffic. Just because you're ditching your car for a bus ride doesn't mean you're not going to get fucked by everyone else's SUV. Being stuck in traffic on a bus is like pretending you're not going to text your ex anymore. It's technically the right thing to do, but it benefits no one, and eventually you're going to get fucked. And then the bus driver is always cranky, or they're not cranky, which is even worse. Like the happy-go-lucky bus drivers, sometimes they sing on the intercom. I don't want none of that shit. I'm smelling piss. I don't want you to be happy about it. And then finally, we have ride shares. I guess? I'm not sure you can really count Uber or Lyft as public transportation. I mean, for one thing, it's usually a private ride. You're cosplaying having a chauffeur, and it's also really bad for the environment. Rideshare is almost worse than owning your own car. Researchers have found that rideshare trips emit nearly 50% more CO2 than trips in private vehicles. This is due to the fact that 42% of drivers are just sitting around waiting to get another ride, so they're just sitting there letting their car run. Uber does like to brag about having like over 60,000 electric vehicles in their fleet, but that's just a drop in the bucket for the staggering 1.5 million vehicles they have available. Taking an Uber is the spiritual equivalent of giving Mother Nature a pack of cigarettes and forcing her to smoke it. Researchers at the University of Kentucky found that ride sharing is responsible for a 3% drop in public train or bus transportation. The drop's even bigger in San Francisco. The introduction of rideshare apps in 2010 reduced bus ridership by 12%. And that's not even mentioning the fact that you're in a stranger's car. Have you ever gotten in an Uber and thought to yourself, this thing is lived in. This person has children. It's just weird. It's like being introduced to a stranger's bedroom. Like, I don't want to know what you get up to on the weekend. So in conclusion, cars suck, but I don't really have a solution. Every form of public transportation comes with a cost, and that cost is usually dealing with, a crazy person or the smell of poop. But even though there might be dangerous people on the train, your odds of dying are way less compared to you just being in a car. And also, if you're still driving to work, you're a sucker. Like in 2024, if you're not doing remote work, get a better job. Unless you're a blue-collar worker, and thank you for doing that. I won't do it, so I'm glad you are. New videos every Wednesday and Saturday. Like, comment, and subscribe. Amtrak, fix your fucking website. I feel like I'm doing an SAT test every time I have to try and buy tickets. Fucking sucks. I know you're not gonna fix it because you're a government entity, but it's fucking awful.